Recorded.
We are live, but you're probably listening to the recording.
Oh, good morning, Silas.
Good morning, Dick. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
You're looking good.
Oh, thank you. You too.
Nice new sweater from Norway.
Nice new sweater from Norway. You got a nice haircut.
High and tight.
High and tight, just how we like it. Nice. Well, a techie topic today, at least to start with. And I know you've thought about this topic a lot. I've thought about it a lot too, but you have specifically thought about it more recently. You've had some uh, events happen near you that kind of spurred on this particular topic. And then it made me think about it a little bit. And do you want to give a little context to that event?
Yeah, totally. Well, so I was out guiding recently in the Gunks and rapping down off a really popular rappel route. And as we were rappelling down, there was a climber who took a lead fall just off the side of where we were and kind of yelled. I'm not sure if the yell was like for like the crux or from falling, but we looked over and watched this climber take what was ended up being a very long fall, probably of, I don't know, 40 or 50-foot fall ultimately. And in the process of that, pulled, I couldn't quite tell, at least one piece that I saw rip. I've heard from other sources maybe like three pieces total pulled out of the wall altogether. The person's helmet flew off, and they essentially kind of cratered on a ledge on their head. And it was pretty ugly, and it kind of shook us up for sure. The person was very injured, needed to have the Rangers come and, take them out in a litter, went to the hospital via helicopter, I believe. My understanding is they're doing okay. They're still in the hospital now, I would think. But, it just kind of like brought up a lot of stuff. First of all, it's pretty intense to witness, obviously, and there's probably some things to talk about there in a different topic. It's been kind of a rough spring overall, in that way, but also just kind of got me thinking. I mean, I do a ton of leading instruction and mentoring, as do you, and like those placing gear well and not having gear rip. Is important. And we're trying to avoid injury all the time on lead, obviously. So I just kind of ruminating on all this stuff and getting into the weeds a little bit with the details. And then we started talking, you and I, and it seemed like a great topic to dive into. So
Yeah.
there's
I
so much
mean,
there.
yeah, like the sentence that comes to mind is every piece matters,
Yeah.
right? There's no piece that doesn't matter, whether you're thinking about it as an individual piece in the moment, like it's the piece closest to you, or it's part of the chain of pieces in the whole system. Like every piece matters. Um, and I actually, because it's what I tend to do. I think about like the historical context of rope systems and what they're really there for. Like if you think about mountaineering 100 plus years ago, like the job of the rope was not to protect the leader. Like the leader was not supposed to fall because the ropes weren't strong enough. They literally would break. Um, if they were to fall. I mean, there was not really a lot of protection. There were pitons. There was rock features, stuff like that. And then as we go through history and equipment evolves, and whether it's technical equipment like carabiners and ropes, or it's even just like better rock climbing shoes, sticky rubber, and then just the consciousness changes of what's possible, what is people are capable of doing, and have new ideas and innovation. All of a sudden now we go from the leader never falls to like you have to fall if you want to become the best climber that you personally can be at this point. Like if you think about a professional rock climber, let's just say Adam Ondra, he spends most of his time falling off routes trying, and that's just a big thing. So the rope and the rope system has moved from just purely a piece of descent and kind of protecting the second to like really a major part of progressing in this as a climber. So it's no longer just there as like your primary protection is just your ability to climb, and the rope is really secondary. We never really want to weight the rope unless we have to. Now it's like weighting the rope is just part of the deal. It's just
Yeah,
part of how we progress into becoming a better climber.
it's
Um,
true. Yeah, it's like absolutely part of the process, like almost daily for a lot of people, right?
Right.
And I think that's the trick is like knowing when it's okay to fall and when it's not okay to fall. And I kind of view it of like blending techniques of like, yeah, basically no fall, no problem. But like, how do I blend the mindset of being in places where I can't fall and know I need to climb well and not fall at all with the modern approach of, yeah, falling is what we do constantly in order to improve, and it's just part of the deal. So I still kind of struggle with like what's the balance between those two things. But I think ultimately that comes down to like decision making, right? Like making good choices about when it's actually and being aware of when it's actually okay to fall and not fall is, I think, the foundation.
Yeah, I mean, because if you climb long enough and in varied terrain, let's say going from crag indoor climbing, we'll just start from there all the way into maybe like alpine climbing. Like there are times and places in your career where you're just gonna have to not fall because you don't have the right equipment, there's no gear, and you just have to make the moves, and that's still a part of climbing. Um, but I do think there's a piece now, and people are pushing so hard, and sometimes that really higher level grade is not in a big mountain context. It's in like a cragging context, but the gear might be hard to get or non-existent. And I just think there's just kind of an interesting confluence of different forces right now that we might be seeing more potential equipment failure in terms of it pulling out of the rock, even though we have like the best gear we've ever had, like historically. Like we have so many options, so many shapes, sizes, colors, brands. Like we just have like the best stuff you could possibly have rock climbing, yet we're still seeing these accidents. And I saw a video of a lead fall, where the person uh, took a pretty big fall, like a 50-ish foot fall. They were actually ultimately fine, a little bit of skin gone, but they pulled 6 cams out, which is a lot. That's a lot of gear in general, but 6 cams, right? And now, granted, the route they were on is pretty hard. The cams are all small granite, so good rock, small cams. Kind of goes from steep slab to like vertical, maybe slightly overhanging. And when I looked at the video and watched the slow mo of the video, like they fell off the crux. The closest piece to them, which actually was a pretty good sized piece, was a number one. That's a pretty good sized piece. It held long enough for the whole system to be tensioned, and then therefore you could see all the lower pieces were getting pulled into alignment with that tension, which must have moved them out of the ideal placement that this person placed them when they were leading. So now when the first piece fell, the rest just like went because they were no longer ideally situated and they were already dealing with really small pieces. So, and once again, fortunately, even though they took this huge fall, like they ended up being okay.
Yikes.
Yeah. So yikes. So Silas, now that we're thinking about every piece matters individually in the system and in the system, like what are some of your thoughts just initially, as maybe like you said, like we both do a lot of leading instruction, like kind of setting that framework for somebody when we're kind of moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the two major categories I think about are strength and security. And these two categories echo through everything we have in climbing. But the first one is pretty obvious, strength, like how strong is the actual piece you're placing in the rock. And we can go down the rabbit hole on that a little bit if we want to, and how I think about that. But then also we have security, which is kind of to your point with pieces being pulled into alignment, or what I might call like the secondary pull, right? Like not being pulled straight down, but being pulled out because a higher piece is clipped, forcing the direction change. So how much security do you have that that piece will stay in the place you want it to still be good enough to hold a fall, despite things like that? And that's just one example of that secondary pull being um, helping or creating compromise in the piece. So those are the first two major categories I think about.
Yeah, I mean, I use some. I think the strength piece is really key. I also think about like another term I use is stability, which I
Hmm.
think would fall into that kind of security piece. Like I'm really looking for not only appropriate size pieces that are well placed, but have a lot of stability because you can have pieces that will work if they're pulled in a very specific direction.
Yep.
But then if you work a little harder or have a little bit more nuance with how you can read the rock and the gear you place, you might find a piece that has a lot of stability. So no matter how it might move, whether you're leading past and the rope's wiggling it, or you even just sit back on the rope and tension the system to take a break, that it doesn't pull it out of alignment or it doesn't pull it in a position where now it's going to fail. So that stability piece is key. And one trend I have noticed when teaching, especially a lot of, maybe it's just the demographic, a lot of new instructors, is that people want to place a lot of tiny gear. Like people love to place
Yeah.
little nuts, tiny cams, and you're like, all right, just build me an anchor. And they're like, they skip like the big obvious good crack and like try to wheedle in some like micro gear, which is a skill set to have. And sometimes you need to do that for sure. But I'm like, can we just go to the low hanging fruit and place the good big gear and the good rock right next to this crack?
Yep.
I think that's a good start because a piece of gear is rated for X amount of kilonewtons, doesn't mean you're going to get that out of that piece of gear if you were to fall on it. That's just breaking strength from the manufacturer of the materials that it's made out of. Not has
Right.
nothing to do with you're going to get 10 kn out of that nut placement now that's in this rock. Because if the rock fails,
Yeah, it's like totally best case scenario that this piece might meet these numbers, right?
yeah, might that's best case scenario
Yeah,
exactly.
and it's oftentimes the human factor, the interface between the piece and the rock, to your point, that is really the weak link, right? Like that's a limiting factor. It's not going to usually be pieces breaking. I've heard of pieces breaking, but almost always there's something weird going on that the piece wasn't pulled in a way that it was meant to be pulled, or repeatedly over an edge or something like that, that created the failure in the piece.
Nice. I mean, I do think like really where one of the places you start in the evaluation of the placement, once again, is just what's the quality of the rock. If the rock's not good, it doesn't matter how good the piece is placed, it's probably not going to hold, right? So
Yeah.
we really have to search around for high quality rock, both in a macro sense. So once again, we're not placing pieces and cracks that are actually boulder. So I would say, is it boulder? Or is it a bedrock? Right? We want to look for good bedrock. But then on the micro sense, is it sandy inside? Is it exfoliating inside? Is our micro features cracks like on like a flake of rock that could break as the piece is weighted? So I think that's really important when we evaluate as we're climbing where and when to place a piece. And sometimes it's really subtle. Sometimes it's like you move a piece less than a half an inch and the piece goes from kind of okay to like, oh, that's really great. Right.
Yep.
And that sometimes
Sometimes
it's just, what's that?
sometimes millimeters.
Millimeters. And it
Yep.
can be just the orientation of the piece. Like you flip a nut 90 degrees and you get a slightly different fit, or flip a cam 180 degrees and get a slightly different fit. Or it's just literally like this side of this little micro crack is solid bedrock and this side is not. And you just place the piece
Yep.
in the better rock.
Yeah, we have all this conglomerate here in the gunks, and oftentimes there's pebbles and little like undulations inside the crack, and just a millimeter or two, one direction or the other, can make it from going from like a totally amazing bomber piece to total crap.
Yeah.
So it's super specific. Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking
Um,
about like how pieces fail, right? Like what is the gear failure compromisation, is that, if that's even a word, the compromising mode that the gear fails in, right? And you said poor macrostructure, like the overall structure of the rock, poor microstructure, so sand, ice, moss, even like algae, not usually water, but sometimes could be some water with some polished rock, or
yeah.
even dry polished rock I've seen cams rip out of, right? Um, Wrong size piece, wrong crack configuration based on the type of piece. We mentioned the pulling out of alignment. All those sort of things can make the piece compromised. Um, yeah, I was watching some videos. I do these like point of view videos for the gunks here, which are kind of fun with a 360 camera. And it's kind of interesting watching myself climb the pitches afterwards. And it just kind of like makes me realize how many little tiny details that are going into the climbing and gear placement, that I just routinely do that kind of don't even notice anymore. And one of them is I place the piece. Of course, I'm looking at it, right? Clipping hold, good stance, hopefully place the piece. And the first thing I do every single time, especially with cams, is give it like a hard yank in the direction it's going to get pulled. And just the starting of the rotation of the cams inside the crack immediately tell me if there's enough friction between the lobes and crack that it's going to stay there and start to rotate and actually cam or just come flying out. And I haven't been surprised by that very often, but I was, I don't know if it was a year or two ago on this route CCK, I had a small cam in a traverse and it looked great to me. And I gave it a yank and it just shot right out of the crack. And I was like, I was like, holy smokes. I placed that piece there routinely. But just the way I put it in this one day was just a little bit weird, or there was a little bit of sand like on the cam lobe or something, and it just shot right out, like no resistance whatsoever. I put it back in, kind of fiddled with it a little bit more, made sure it was all clean, and then it was bomber. So we obviously can't test like how strong that piece is, but we can at least test the initial biting of the cam lobes or the nut in the crack too to start that initial placement being drawn where you want it to be. Um,
I think that's actually really important because I've seen, like you said, pieces that are perfectly placed, even pieces that aren't that small. And I'm going to just use cams as an example. Like, oh, that's a perfect placement in good rock. Pull right out because the rock is polished. Maybe it's a little moist out that morning, so that that polish now has a little bit of a lubricating layer, and it just zings right out of there, right? And I've seen pieces that I'm like, wow, that's a horrible piece. I'm like, but it didn't fail. I'm
yeah,
like, it held in there, but man, that would scare me if I saw that piece and I
yeah,
fell on that. So I've seen things go both ways, and I think one thing that people may not do as they're, especially as they're getting into trad leading, is I don't think people weight gear a lot because it's scary, right? I mean, it still scares me sometimes. I'm like, whoa, I haven't fallen on a piece of gear in a long time. Is that going to hold? And I think it's important to actually go out and not just pull on gear and see what happens, but like weight some gear and see what happens. And one classic way is just to like go find a really good top rope that's got great gear placements and like do some aiding, little,
yep,
A1, just to stand on gear and watch nut shift or watch cam shift or watch whatever you're placing shift, and go, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting now that I put some weight on it, or bounce test some stuff and see what happens, as one way of just gaining some confidence in just the mechanics of that equipment and how it's actually reacting under load in probably more ideal situations. And on a top rope, obviously, you have the protection of not getting hurt while you kind of experiment with that,
yeah,
um, which can be
yeah.
one of the.
It's a great point. I kind of wonder like what the demographic is that tends to get hurt by lead falls. And I don't know that it's the people that are just starting out, because I think, like you're saying, people are pretty worried about gear pulling. And so they're more conservative. I think it's the people that have been doing it for a little while and have gained confidence in the pieces, but not grounded that confidence with like real world testing of pieces routinely. So I think it's like it's kind of like for I don't know, this is a hypothesis. It's like after the initial curve and like you're kind of like in there doing your thing with some confidence and feeling good about stuff, but not like the real a bunch of data proving that your pieces are really as good as you think they are, right? Like I think probably we all make mistakes and place gear that we don't think is was not as good as we think it is. But if that ratio is enough that it catches up with you, that's a problem. So I encourage people to, I mean, place big pieces on lead, of course, because there's generally more strength there, but there's also more leeway for the security or stability to not be compromised, right? You have more leeway in the overall piece moving or shifting, but also place way more gear than they think, and even like nesting two pieces, three pieces side by side sometimes, so that if you're only, batting whatever 700 out of your 1,000 potential points for like perfect score, if you're batting 700 but you're placing half again as much gear, at least your percentage is high enough that you're going to get caught and held off the ledge all the time.
Yeah,
So
I
just
think your no fall, no problem comment is pretty apt because if you lead a pitch, maybe it's your going for a personal record or whatever, a high point, and you get to the top and you clip whatever the anchor, come down, and you never fell on that route. You're not getting the feedback whether or not those pieces are going to hold. Like, you're like, oh, awesome, I nailed it. It's like, well, you got through the physical part, yes, but you haven't proven that the rest of the system actually works oftentimes. So I think sometimes we are presented when we have success, and maybe also another way of thinking about it is like, I only lead moderate routes I know I can lead because I'm afraid of falling on gear, so therefore I never fall on gear. Like, you're not really ever proving that your gear will work because
Right.
you're always being successful. So you kind of get in this like success trap, right? Where it's like, oh, I don't know if this actually works because I just never fall because of whatever,
Yep.
which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, like the saying I tell people a lot is have two pieces between you and the hospital. Like that's the first step. And then if you want to have more, obviously even better. And I think that I'm thinking about this conversation. We've talked about leading and stuff previously, but I think it'd be cool to get into the nitty-gritty about like how to do that. Like there's this whole topic about nesting and increasing the security in a very nuanced way. That I think might be interesting to get into at some point in this conversation, um, if you're interested in that.
Oh, I'm totally. I mean, that's kind of where my brain's going right now. Is like, what are some tangibles? Like, what are
Yeah.
some things we could discuss right now that someone could start at least thinking about and maybe incorporating into their own practices? Some of the things that we have seen as people are leading, as we're coaching them to lead, or things we see just in general, just peripheral things.
Yeah.
Um, I do think there's a piece too, like arguably you and I spend, well, I used to spend more time on the cliff, but we have spent a lot of time on the cliff. So our exposure to the hazard is significantly higher than the average recreational climber. We're just out all the time, every day. And we're also doing it for a slightly different reason. Like, we are doing it as a profession. So like, we're not just out there to have fun. Um, so I think just by the nature of those matrix, we're trying to reduce our vulnerability now that we have a lot of exposure by being a lot more thoughtful about how and when and why we place gear for it to do all the things that we want it to do to protect us as the guide leader, but also to protect the second people that we're bringing up. So I think we have a little different perspective on that matrix than some other folks may have who don't put that time in the saddle.
Yeah, I was out with a guy last week, and he's been leading for a couple years, but he doesn't lead consistently that much. So he's doing a good job, but there's a lot of holes in like the overall picture that he's able to paint for himself. So it's a great place to have mentorship and some guidance, right? Um, and I was telling him he wants to be independent and go climb with his partner on his own, bring his kids out and stuff. And I was like, you have to understand that there are two demographics that are at extremely high risk in this game. One is me, because I'm out here, 200 days a year for the last 20 years, whatever. But the other one is you, right? Like the very early part of the curve where you don't, like we're saying, have this like critical mass of data and time spent doing it to be able to see all the pieces that are affecting the security of you on the pitch. So I was trying to impress upon him that point, and I think what that tells me also is that most climbers, if you've been doing it for, a few years, they're not in the high risk category anymore. So the probability is probably a little bit lower, but of course it's always there, right? So we're still trying to stack the odds all the time.
I think one tangible thing that I see a lot of people do when I'm coaching them is they will pass really easy placements that are high quality because the climbing's quote unquote easy, right? And it's like, well, there are so many examples of people getting hurt on easy terrain because of various things, but there's this complacency, like, oh, it's easy, I'll go a little higher. And it's like, well, if it's easy to place the gear and it's fast, like, just put it in. Because once again, that's part of the system. So if you make a mistake, you slip, hold brakes, someone drops something above you, you're in a busy crag, even though you're on easy terrain, you have that protection, right?
Yep.
So especially as we are close to the ground or close to ledges, So we really want to protect ourselves from hitting something horizontal, right? That's a big deal. And like some people are like, oh, they talk about like the soft ground catch. Like, oh, well, it'll be a soft ground fall. I'm like, no, no, don't hit the ground, period. So that means placing more gear as we are closer to those types of hazards, right? We're trying to protect ourselves from a hazard. So I think that horizontal hazard is really key. But we also have to think about other hazards because wherever we place gear, if we fall, that is now a pivot point. So it might swing us either into more hazard, say like a dihedral, or maybe away from hazard, maybe like a pointy, scary rock, right? So not only does the protection have to hold us kind of in a vertical sense, like scale, like so we don't hit the ground or a ledge, but where does it put us side to side? So if we fall, that it actually places us in our rope and other things into a better position versus a worse position. So just kind of thinking about the route and kind of breaking it down in that sense, like protecting early and often when we have horizontal hazards, but what are the other hazards that might be presented that aren't necessarily horizontal, vertical hazard, and so on and so forth, that the pieces will also help protect us if we were to fall.
Yeah, totally. And I think you can do both those things a lot of times from before you're actually on the pitch. Like in the planning phase of looking at the pitch and deciding what to do, you can be thinking about those things, right? Ground fall, where are my first three pieces going to be to keep me off the ground, where are the ledges on the pitch, and then to your point, like what's the rope line that I want to both reduce drag, but also reduce placing me into a place that I don't want to be while on the pitch. Like if you think about placing gear as you would on a nice bolted route, right? Like you want those bolts to be above the crux move and in a way that kind of swings you away from the hazards. Yeah,
Yeah.
great points.
I also think another place where there's some subtlety is when we're, especially when we're trad climbing, is what is the effective way to use alpine draws, quick draws on pieces, right? Like obviously on some pieces, like a nut or a Tricam, you have to use something. There's just no wiggle room. When we're starting to deal with spring-loaded camming devices, there's a sling there, so you can clip that. Some of them have extendable slings, so you can extend things. And sometimes I'll see people like this is classic. Like they're pretty close to the ground. They place a good cam in the crack, right? And then they add this big runner, and the route just goes straight up and down. And I'm like, well, all you're doing is putting yourself closer to the ground by adding this runner. You're not reducing rope drag. You're not, because of the nature of where the belayer is in the route. You're not adding anything by this sling. Um, so it's like being really thoughtful about when to add a sling or when to extend a sling, I think is pretty, like you're in the gunks, like you're climbing roofs all the time. Like that's a kind of a constant game. Like if I go short, I have more protection, but then I have to go over a roof where there's more rope drag. So that'll be a problem later. So what is the right thing to do? But I think that that piece of when and where to use a sling or to extend a sling is pretty key. And it goes beyond just, I always do it. And it goes beyond just for rope drag, but it goes also like, can I shorten the fall, here? Or do I need this to really help keep this piece more stable? So there's
Yeah,
less rope wiggle affecting it. So,
totally. Yeah, I had a buddy here from Idaho who was helping me teach a rock guide course for the AMGA a few weeks ago, and he brought out his a single rack and his draws, and he had the shortest quick draws I have ever seen. They were so cute. They were like literally like 3 or 4 inches long, and I was kind of giving him a hard time. Super light carabiners, super short draws, which he was talking about projecting some things out in the desert, and I'm like, yeah, that makes total sense when it's a hand crack that goes straight up with a little bit of variation here and there. But in the gunks here, you're going to want some longer draws because the roots are pretty complex. Like you're constantly meandering because of the horizontal nature of the cracks back and forth and trying to find the weakness, which is not just a straight up and down crack, plus all the roofs. Yep. Yeah, I basically want to have my fall be as short as possible all the time without excessive rope drag, right? And so I try to identify where the cruxes of the pitch are as much as possible beforehand, or even on the pitch too. And I try to have those cruxes be shorter draws, so I'm not falling as far, and pieces around them, both below and above, with longer draws to give me more leeway. so I can keep the fall short at the lip of the roof, for example, right? Like, so the pieces underneath the roof as I'm leading up to it might be slung really long. So it's a nice gradual arc to the lip of the roof. And then I might have a cam right at the lip of the roof that has even no draw on it at all to keep that fall short when I'm going over the roof, minimize that distance. And then once I'm past the roof, I might sling it long again, just to keep the rope drag down overall. So I think you can be nuanced about the length of the draws relative to the crux too.
I mean, I think it's kind of highlights another good point, like, protect yourself like on a top out, like place a piece right there just so like you don't blow it on a top out move, you know? Because remember, every time you run something out, when you may have a choice to add more gear, if you fall, that last piece has to hold. It just has to hold. And if it doesn't, you know, I mean, you know how it is. It's like, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to hit the ground, but this falls horrible.
Yeah.
Like I still don't want that to happen. So, given in a situation where you have the options to place gear and you choose not to, which is a legitimate choice sometimes, remember if things don't go the way you want them to do, that gear has to work. Otherwise, things are going to start getting exponentially more uncomfortable for everybody involved. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of brings up 2 points for me. One is, uh, people are often worried, I think, especially early on in their leading career, they're worried about the pitch further on, not having gear further up on the pitch, which is a concern for sure. Um, but if you do a good job of zooming out and picking good pitches to lead in the first place, you can kind of alleviate that to some extent. But I would just say, like, don't trade less security now for the fear of having less security later on the pitch. Like, basically, you almost always have, not always, but often have a chance to lower off the pitch or build an anchor and bring somebody up if you run out of gear, by coming down the pitch, even if you have to. People have built belays mid-pitch, myself included, as you need to, whenever you need to. Nothing saying you can't do that. So don't trade security now for the fear of not having security later. Like, don't be afraid to double up now on pieces or place big pieces now when you need them, just because you're worried about not having the security later. There's some balance there. But the other piece of that is, to your point about every piece mattering, there's this whole topic of nesting. And I guess I would include maybe some like fixed gear in that nesting conversation as well, and like how to deal with that, how to deal with placing multiple pieces or having multiple pieces in the equation, um, and increasing your security easily. So if we want to talk about the nitty gritty, we could certainly talk about that stuff a little bit.
I mean, we're here. Let's do it.
The first thing that comes to mind is like the clipping height, right? Like, people are oftentimes, especially above a ledge or above the ground, you place a piece above your head and it feels really secure to clip it high, right? If you're if you're gonna clip it above your head, you've got to make darn sure you're not gonna fall during that, and you have to be really sure the piece is good. Because if you fall or if the piece is not good and it fails, you're introducing a whole bunch more slack into the system, and then you actually might hit the ground, or whatever, some kind of bad long fall scenario. So if you're worried about the piece, whether it's a fixed piece like an old piton or a fixed nut or cam, or the piece is small, I try to sling those things long, at least initially, so it's below my waist to clip. So if I blow the clip or I slip during that process and I either slip and fall or the piece blows, that I haven't introduced like 6 or 8 feet additional into the fall. Um, So get it below your waist. If you climb up past the piece and the piece is now below your waist, you can clip it short again to keep the fall short as you go past it. But first thing for me is clipping below your waist if you're at all in question about slipping while clipping or the actual piece's integrity.
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think that the nesting thing is pretty key. You know, anytime we're faced with small pieces, excuse me. Once again, I think a lot of people are putting a lot of faith on small gear, and I certainly have in my career. Um, Placed a lot of small cams and a lot of small nuts. But there's just like as you said, there's just so little margin of error with small gear. But also as the rock quality is a little bit less than ideal, you know, clustering pieces just to like hopefully things will all stay in or enough things will stay in, and kind of spreading that gear out kind of in a smaller sphere of space, but like trying not to load all the force into one area of rock where it's a little bit less good. So kind of clustering, but also spreading things out as one might need to is kind of important. Um, and I also think, you know, when we're kind of going into like that clustering mode, maybe you're going into a crux sequence. This is where like a special piece of gear, like a locker draw, can be kind of nice. You know, once again, it's not just about, well, does the gear hold, but will the rope stay in the carabiner? Because I've
Yes.
definitely seen accidents recently, actually, where a carabiner, the rope didn't stay in the carabiner. Carabiner was gone. Like person fell and just like, whoa, where'd the they fell a lot further because that thing they were clipped to, the rope is no longer in that. I remember years ago climbing with Peter, it's on Katahdin. This was like decades ago. We're climbing the Flatiron. It was the first time we both done it. And I brought my like super light alpine rack, and he's up there leading the crux pitch. And there's this little overlap. And he kind of yells down to me. He's like, "This is a pretty ethereal rack for this route." And I was like, "Oh, he's just gonna build an anchor and bring me up." And then I see him up there kind of like fussing. I see him put another piece in, and I see him grab a locker and clip the rope. I'm like, "Oh, he's going to the chains on this." He's doubled down on pieces and put a locker on his draw. Like he is gonna go for it. And he did, and it was beautiful climbing. But like just having that forethought to like, let's double down, let's give us a little more security because we're choosing to now go further because that's the choice we made.
Totally. Yeah, I try to think about like what's the weakness of this like little micro system like that I'm looking at right here, and how do I think it could fail? And I don't have like a formula for that, um, but I try to figure out what the weak link is. And so if it's a like a fixed pin that I clip with, say, a long alpine draw, okay, the weak link I think might be the pin. So I might be able to place a piece next to it, not so close it could be compromised if the pin blows, but a piece next to it, like a cam or something. And I might be able to clip the sling on the cam, that carabiner, into the actual sling itself. So that the sling, if the piton blows, it's now weighting the cam, but I've only used one draw. So there's that kind of uh, way of nesting versus putting a cam in with a whole separate draw on it, or even just clipping the actual carabiner on the cam itself. And I don't know. I try to think about two pieces and two non-lockers on the rope. So in that example I just gave, you have one alpine draw clipped to a pin, a cam clipped to the same sling. Well, now the weak link in my mind is not the strength of my pieces, it's the rope on the one non-locker, right? So I can use another non-locker as an example with two ops and a pose on the long end of the alpine draw, or a locker, to your point, I think. Now I've got a locker or two non-lockers and two pieces. Now I'm really psyched. And that's kind of like linking them together. Or I could have just two separate pieces with two draws and have them totally separate. And I don't know what the answer is there, except for rope drag matters and how strong and secure and stable I think those pieces are also plays in. Like if I have two pieces that I think are like honestly pretty marginal strength wise, I'm probably going to do something like Magic X or Sliding X them together with a draw or a locker, just to like really reduce the force on each piece. Versus if I think the pieces are good and strong, but they might shift or be compromised in some way and pull out because of that, I might clip them separately. So I don't know what the the actual calculus there is, but I do try to think about like how would this system fail, and what do I think the most likely way it's going to fail is.
Nice. You know, the fun trick is if you are a DMM user, if you like DMM cams, those extendable slings are long enough that if you place two DMM cams close enough together, you can actually Magic X with the sling off of one of them to the other one. Or if there's just another piece, um, it's kind of slick. You can't do that with any other cams because their slings are too short most of the time. But there actually kind of brings in some like interesting like tactics that can be kind of old school. Like, so like bringing two pieces together to build like a little micro anchor. And we can debate all you want, whether Magic X or pre-equalize, whatever. But there's also like pieces in series, kind of a little bit more like you were describing with clipping the carabiner from the cam sling into the sling on the piton. So you can do that in a various ways, but pieces in series is actually a very old school way of connecting pieces in a line.
Yeah.
And essentially, like all the pieces above the lowest piece is preventing the lowest piece from popping out. It's also an old school ice climbing technique. There's like pieces in opposition, which is kind of a classic thing when you have a horizontal crack and you have two nut placements that are facing each other, right? And you need to tie them off in a way that they're opposing. So when you actually pull on them, they're pulling towards each other and acting as a piece that will take a downward force. But that could also be piece in opposition could be protecting a piece from getting lifted out of a crack in a vertical scenario, whether that's like off the anchor, like a trad anchor, and you want to protect from a vertical lift of the belayer, or it could be literally like protecting a cam or more commonly a nut in a placement that see like a rising traverse sometimes where it's like as you keep going up the traverse, you place a nut part way, but then as you keep going higher and higher, the sling lifts the nut out, right? And all of a sudden it just falls out, or a cam, because I've seen that happen too. So like having a piece in opposition that prevents that piece from getting lifted out of a crack in the right scenario. So I think there's some like cool old school tricks that can come into kind of giving you a little more nuance when it comes to protecting things with more limited gear, but sometimes a little more fiddle factor, right? To kind of set it
Sure.
up, but might be really useful for that given situation.
Yeah, totally. And sling length matters a lot in those situations too, right? So if I think this is what you're describing, like if I climb a corner system and place a nut and then with a short alpine sorry, I'm climbing a corner, I place a nut that I think could get pulled up and out if I'm not careful, and I put a short quick draw on there and go another couple feet and place say a cam that will resist an outward pull, but I sling it long with a 2-footer and then I, traverse to an anchor, say left a ways, well, the nut's going to get pulled on first because it has a short draw on it. Versus if I reverse that, right? If I go up and place the nut with a long alpine draw, go a little higher, place a cam with a short draw, short sport draw, or even the cam itself. Now that cam is keeping the rope in alignment so that nut's not getting pulled sideways. So in that case, if I'd fall and blow the cam or the cam comes unclipped, that nut isn't getting pulled out at all, but rather getting pulled down if I were to have to weight it because the upper piece pulled or got unclipped.
Yeah, super subtle. Just a simple change of equipment, right? This
Yeah.
goes to here and that goes to there, and it could have a very drastic difference in the outcome of the piece staying in the rock or not.
A lot of these situations we're describing, I think the solution is, do I have the bandwidth and overall like kind of ability while I'm climbing to see the bigger picture? And so by just zooming out a little bit, like literally just like pushing yourself off the rock and leaning back on the handholds, for example, and trying to see like how what you're doing plays into the bigger picture, which a lot of is like kind of where we're going next, how that all plays together can really help you strategize about how this can work and how it would not work. Um, and that's both from the ground, I think, like zooming out, looking at the whole pitch, but also on the pitch itself, trying to like do the climbing, zoom in, see the details, and then zoom out simultaneously or intermittently to see the bigger picture too.
Yeah. I also think there's this piece of we're always trading something to gain something. And one of those pieces is weight versus enough gear. Like I see a lot of people, and me included, like, I want to reduce the weight because it's harder to climb when you have more weight on you. But you're forced now into doing the best you can with what you have, in terms of your types of gear and quantity of gear. So therefore, you place gear wherever, and now you don't have the right size for later on. And there's a certain piece of when you're going to a new route you've never been to before and you don't really know much about it, maybe just a grade, like that's just part of the game, and you can say that's fun, it's kind of fun. But if you know the route and you have a lot of beta on it, like, you should bring not only the equipment that it's necessary, but I think a little more. Like, how many times have you led a pitch where you're like, I think I need 4 draws, and then you wish you had 7? Like, I've done
Yeah.
that a ton of my life. Like, oh, I should just bring, and the gear's so light now, so just bring the lighter, the couple extra draws. Um, and then I also think there's a piece of the type of gear you bring can make your options more or less limiting. So, like, I like to have a gear selection where there's a lot of overlap in sizes in that mid range.
Mhm.
Obviously, if you need climb a route that has a lot of big gear, you need to bring a lot of big gear. But like for most trad routes, I think an average trad route, like just by having some larger nuts and I'll just say it, some Tricams. I'm a Tricam person. Um, I now have pieces that overlap. So I have pieces that are the same size and some pieces that will work in specific types of cracks, like a nut in a tapering crack, or a cam that may or may not work in that tapering crack, but would work in a parallel crack, or something like a Tricam or even a hex that will work essentially in both those types of cracks. So I've now just expanded my options. And if I have to build trad anchors, I might use all the easy gear, cams and nuts while I'm leading, and I might use the gear that's a little bit more fiddly at the anchor. I love bringing some medium sized hexes in the Alpine because they're pretty light and they just kind of work really well with like goofy Alpine cracks. And it's like, oh, these are great for anchors, right? I may or may not place them on lead. I may. I'm not afraid to, but you know, they kind of save that. And I'll just save my quick gear, quick cam placements for when I'm actually leading. So that's just
Absolutely.
one way of thinking about it. One strategy that someone could employ into their framework as approaching a route.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just getting good with the nut craft, right? I mean, you can carry 10 or 12 nuts versus a couple cams, and you have now 10 or 12 pieces versus just 2 cams that you'll be able to place just once or twice. Um, so that obviously the better you are and the more savvy you are at seeing those things and utilizing things that are more multifunctional, the more you can save the weight for things that matter. I mean, just stripping down the rest of your rack, like the lockers and belay plates and cordelettes and slings, all that stuff. I try to have people carry way fewer lockers than they're probably comfortable with almost all the time. And this is true in guiding programs too. I just try to have the stuff be really versatile and light that you aren't using on the pitch, so you can bring more rack, because the racks is the stuff that's really going to reduce your risk overall. So
Yeah.
being more savvy and more experienced and able to do things with less gives you more leeway to bring the things you really need.
Yeah. I mean, like for me, my personal thing is like all the carabiners, locking carabiners in my harness are all HMS style because they will do everything,
Yeah.
right? I start getting some really specific locking carabiners that like small little D's, like they only do some things well, where HMS will kind of do all the things pretty well,
Yeah.
and therefore I can bring less lockers.
Or that goofy Grigri carabiner. Is it the Freno?
Throw
Oh
that in
my
the ocean.
gosh. I know
Just
people
throw
like
that right
that.
in the ocean.
People like that thing for single pitch setting. I'm sure it's great, but man, not very versatile and heavy and expensive. Oh
And
man,
fiddly to get on and off your harness.
it is. Yep.
Not saying it doesn't have merit, but just throw it right in the ocean, is my
I,
opinion.
I,
That
I
thing.
did want to mention one thing about pitons,
Mhm.
and maybe we've talked about this before, but if we haven't, that's fine. If we already have, that's fine too. Point being, people ask me a lot of times, like, what do you think about pitons? Like, do you clip pitons? And the first part of it is, well, I, I heard it described as if it's there, there's only 2 scenarios. One, it's there and it's good and people have fallen on it and it hasn't ripped out yet. So you might as well clip it. The other is, well, people clip it, but no one's ever fallen on it because it's easy above that. Either way, you might as well clip it if you run out and see what happens, right? But a lot of times, like when we're all this nesting stuff or worrying about security above, um, I would encourage people, regardless of what the fixed piece is, just get that thing clipped below your waist so you're not introducing more rope into the fall, like we talked about before. Clip it long so it's below your waist. So at least if you fall now, you're not going to go the distance, right? Then you can figure out whatever you've got to do beyond that. You can evaluate the pin much better. You can back it up. You can place other pieces and back clean the pin. You can magic X, sliding X it together with another piece. But if there's a fixed piece there and you're run out and worry about the fall distance, there's no reason to clip it as long as you're not introducing more fall distance. And then you can figure out the details later. Even if you place a piece that's like somewhat questionable, you're not sure about it, but you're run out and or pumped, get it clipped in a way that again doesn't increase your fall distance, and then decide what you want to do with it, right? Most pieces that are in the wall are at least going to hold body weight. And so if you clip into it even directly with a draw or something, you can probably hang on it if you need to without introducing more fall distance. And if it's even a little bit better, you can introduce the 2-to-1 pulley effect by clipping it through with your rope, right? So I would just encourage people if you're run out or above your last piece a long ways or pumping out, get something clipped first and then figure out if you like it or how to deal with it later. Again, I'm not encouraging people to do that above their heads. So don't clip things above your head that you or above your waist that you think might be questionable. But give yourself some time by at least clipping in initially to figure out what you want to do.
Yeah, totally. So I want to bring back a comment you made earlier, and that was the comment of nutcraft,
Hmm.
which I think personally more people should get better at placing passive gear.
Yeah.
There's nothing I would rather place than a well placed nut. Or the best thing, the thing that makes me feel like the warmest and fuzziest inside is a giant hex endwise in a big tapering crack. I'm like, I can go to sleep now. This is awesome, right? And
But
I
why?
get it.
What about those pieces make you feel that good?
Well, so think about it. Like the interesting thing about our kind of spectrum of pieces is if we say like a wired nut example, that is the simplest piece of gear we carry on our rack. It is just a blob of metal on a piece of wire, right? Yet it can be finicky and hard to place and subtle sometimes to do that. So the whole term nutcraft is kind of this great thing. It's like learning how to deal with that, where cams are just like plug it in the crack and you go, right? But they are the most complicated piece that we have in terms of how it's made, how it kind of works, right? We're really, remember, cams work on friction. They work on the friction of the cam lobes expanding to put more force on the rock. So if we have polished rock, gritty rock, all these things, the piece may fail because there's not enough friction. But nuts, when they're placed well in good constrictions, that's not a thing. It can't go through the constriction even if it's wet, right? So I just think that getting a better appreciation for other types of gear besides just cams. Like I see, like I'll teach like young guides, and they show up and they have like a double rack of cams and like half a set of nuts. I'm like, hey, nuts are lighter, they're less expensive, but they are super useful. And I really like well placed nuts. And I think once you get better at all the pieces, you realize that you can place nuts in ways that will take loading from multiple directions. It's not necessarily just the piece. We tend to put the pieces in like its own little lane, like, oh, nuts are only good for one direction. It's really more dictated on the placement itself. I've seen cams that can only take loading from one direction. And I've seen nuts that you could literally pull it in any direction and it'd be fine.
Yep.
So I think just getting more familiarity with each piece in its kind of normal range. So like what is the ideal placement? Like we're always trying to place like the piece as it would come out of the textbook, right? The picture, like we want the picture. And if we have to stray from that, we can, but always kind of shooting for that ideal picture. And then once we have those ideal placements kind of dialed in and can kind of read the rock, where can we find the subtle placements that are maybe less typical, but are still really good? Like sometimes in a more parallel crack, there might be some real subtle wastes in there that a nut will fit that you don't see when you're new at placing nuts, but when you get more experience, you're like, oh, there's an awesome nut right here. Actually tricams are really good for this. Like you can place tricams in some pretty outrageous positions that are really pretty strong. They might lose some stability because of those placements in those ways, but they're actually strong and they don't look like the textbook at all. But you're like, that thing's not coming out as long as it gets loaded this way. And then likewise cams too. Like, you just have to be really a technician. Because I see a lot of people just kind of plug cams, and they're not really great,
Yeah,
you know. And just because you pulled on a piece and put 5 or 10 pounds of force on it doesn't mean it's going to hold when you put like 3 or 4 kilonewtons of force on it, right? So I think that piece is also worth kind of recognizing.
for sure. Yeah, I'll double down too on the simplicity of those pieces, as well as the tricams. I don't carry tricams in my day-to-day climbing in the gunks these days, but I do have a set still that I bring if I'm going to a place like Millbrook, if I'm going to go alpine climbing or winter climbing, or there's a rock type that just works well with. And to be fair, the gunks is a place tricams work really well with. Um, if there are some cracks in places that you can get a tricam where nothing else would work, like
Yep.
literally nothing else would give you any security at all. And a tricam is just absolutely bomber. And especially with the black ones now, like the black, was it black, pink, um, blue, brown, like those sizes? Sorry,
Don't get
red.
red.
Yeah, black, pink, red, brown, and maybe the blue one after that, the royal, like the royal purple blue. Um, like those pieces are just absolutely bomber if you place them well.
Yeah. Actually, there's a young guy that I know who actually carries some big tricams, like some of
Nice.
the bigger ones, and I'm always like, huh, that's kind of interesting. And I realized like some of it's just kind of ego, like, oh, you got the big tricams, but I've seen this person place some awesome big tricams, and I'm like, that thing's awesome.
Nice.
I'm not gonna say no to that. I'm clipping that right now, you know. So there is a little bit of an ego piece of like what's cool and what's not cool in terms of what you have on your rack and what you know. If as long as you've got small totems and no big tricams, you're cool, right? Or whatever the matrix is. This I've just always been a big fan of them, and they just do a lot of things for me. So, but
That's awesome.
more options for more fun.
Totally. I mean, a couple like detaily things about like clipping pieces that come to mind. Um, on the pitch, whether you're nesting or not. Um, sometimes I'll use if I don't have a lot of extra stuff to double up, like I don't have a locker draw or I don't have extra non-lockers to put two on a sling. If you have an alpine draw, you can basket hitch the draw through the actual sling on the cam, and then use those two carabiners on the draw to do an opposite and opposed kind of thing on that basketed sling, right? So now you've got a really bomber piece that has even have one extra carabiner on the cam potentially if you wanted to use it somewhere, but at least basket hitch it with two opposite and opposed non-lockers, and you've got just a trucker piece if it's sizable and obviously strong and secure. So that's one thing that comes to mind a little bit. Um, Certainly carrying like a 120 centimeter sling, a 4 foot runner, or even using your anchoring material on the pitch to make things longer if you need to. If you run out of draws, can be really helpful. And then and this is kind of what happens for me sometimes is I run out of alpine draws. I carry kind of like half alpine draws and half quick draws. If I run out of alpine draws and only have quick draws, but I want a little bit more length, I'll actually link two quick draws together. And how you do that, I think, matters also. I try to avoid carabiner on carabiner all the time, right? Just because of the twisting, unclipping potential, not so much the strength potential, obviously, right? Like carabiner on carabiner is plenty strong, but they could twist and unclip more easily than if you have a flexible runner or a cam sling that it can rotate on, which is why we use quick draws. So anyway, I'll take a quick draw and clip the end on the cam sling that doesn't have the plastic loop holding it there. So I'll clip it like normal. So the rope is on the rubber or plastic kind of noose end. Then before I clip the rope in though, so I have the cam, the quick draw clipped normally. I'll take a second quick draw and take the carabiner off of the end that goes on the cam and clip that to the rope end carabiner that I've already have there. So I have basically two draws in a row with three carabiners, and then clip the rope to the bottom carabiner.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Once again, if you look at history, when you look at people leading routes, like before runners were really a thing, you would see two non-lockers clipped to each other all the time as part of the protection system. Like that's how they extended
Yeah,
off the piece, you know. And there, like you said, it's more of a twisting thing than a strengthening. And strengthening is fine at all. And just to clarify, I know there's someone out there's going, you can't put soft on soft. You can 100% basket hitch a sling to another sling. Like A, it's crazy strong, and B, nothing's moving, right? We're not talking about a moving rope running through a sling, right? You can't have stationary soft good with a moving soft good through that. That's
Yep.
no. The stationary soft good to a stationary soft good, much like you tie the rope to your harness, soft good to soft good, is totally fine. And a great way to kind of, once again, maximize that other carabiner if you really want to go opposite opposed to give yourself a little more security with the rope staying into the piece.
Yeah. And I'll mention also like girth hitching, because I'm sure someone at least out there is thinking, what about just girth hitching the sling to the cam loop? And for me, it would be a question of the size of the material in both the cam loop and the alpine draw. So if I have like really tiny, skinny Dyneema nylon blend in both those cases, I'd try to avoid avoid girth hitching. But if I have like a pretty robust nylon sling on the cam, and then a 9/16 nylon webbing sling that's my alpine draw, bigger material, fatter material, that the girth hitching, in my opinion, would be stronger and would be more appropriate. So I try to avoid very skinny material girth hitch to very skinny material.
That's
You could even do like one skinny material on another fatter material maybe, and that would probably be plenty strong enough.
Silas. Let's talk a little bit about like the obvious example of placing gear and how critical it is in terms of all these factors, and that's like traversing pitches,
Mm.
right? Like that's like the classic, like, wow, we now need to go horizontally, which is not uncommon in the gunks. Like I just got to like shuffle along this horizontal crack for 8, 10, 15 feet till I get to another root. Awesome. But just traversing pitches in general, like what are some things we should start thinking about in terms of how we protect that? And remember, as the route gets more and more traversing, we have to protect it for everybody involved, the leader and the second, because the second can take as bad a falls as the leader can on certain traversing terrain, and get swung into hazards, right? That the leader may not get swung into because of just the nature of the direction they're traveling.
Yeah, totally. Uh, so the classic thing that happens, I think, frequently is that the leader comes up to a crux move on a traverse. They're like, "Oh wow, that looks pretty hard. I'll plug a piece here, get some great gear." Does the move, sweet, okay, that's done, and then proceeds to like kind of quest off to the anchor, right? And if it continues going across, then that leaves the second having to clean the piece and then do the crux move without any piece there to protect them if they were to fall in that crux move. So you're trying to adapt what I call the second's perspective, especially as a guide for sure, in that you probably want to place a piece before the crux for you as the leader, do the crux move, and then have some protection after the crux for the follower. That's the easiest example I can think of.
Yeah, and this is where like what type of piece and how it's placed really matters, especially if you think about like a route that kind of starts vertical and then arcs into or takes a hard dog like into a traverse. Like that pivot point is critical. So if that pivot point fails, it's bad for both parties, the leader or the second. So this is where really good placement of gear, maybe nesting some stuff, a locker draw could be a really critical thing, or two opposite and opposed carabiners to really protect that critical thing. If you're on a long traverse and you're placing gear regularly, right? Yeah, there's still hazard there, but now you're kind of just into this kind of like stable mode of travel, and you're no longer having like this like critical pivot point. But this, once again, the gear and traverses is tricky because you now have to be able to protect the leader falling, the second falling. So there's a huge swing of angle that that piece now needs to function in to work um, appropriately for that traverse.
Yeah, it's like the opposite direction horizontally, right? So the leader would fall and pull it back to the right, we'll say, and the second would fall and pull it over to the left.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly. So, and then once again, with a rising traverse, you can have situations where pieces can get lifted out if you don't use appropriate runners or you don't have good stability in those pieces. um, in the placements themselves. So I do think we have to spend a lot more time thinking about traversing pitches. Um, and remember, like a leader, as you're leading out, sometimes you get the benefit of you can do a little bit of attention, right? As you're kind of leading out, which is a benefit. The leader, the second doesn't get the tension to make the moves. They just have to make the moves. So oftentimes traversing pitches are harder for a second person than they are for the leader because of that nature of that tension piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I kind of wonder if we should zoom out a little bit and talk about other factors with this leading piece that relate to it, like in the preparation and kind of team part of it, um, or not.
Well, do you want to do that in this conversation? Or do you want to start another conversation? I'm happy to go wherever you want.
It's kind of a whole nother conversation, really.
It kind of is another conversation.
Maybe we should let people wait
Digest
for that
this a little
one.
bit.
Yeah, this is a lot already.
Well, how about this? We'll kind of taper out with this. A great place to gain some more experience and knowledge and mentoring of this is with Silas Rossi at the Ascend program.
You're too good to me.
Because one of the things that Silas is really focusing on besides community with his program is ease of access, affordability, but really trying to help people become a complete climber, right? So we're working on not just the technical things, how to build an anchor, but like how do we approach, what's their mindset of approaching a given route? What's the team that we build around that? Like what's the process that goes into to being a complete climber? Because most of us probably focus on some of our strengths and have a lot of weaknesses or blind sides, and he's really trying to like look at it as a whole picture, so ultimately you can progress into the climbing that you might want to do, that you kind of have aspirations for, but do it in a way that is A, sustainable, B, fun, and C, efficient. Because who doesn't want to be have fun, make it go more smoothly, more efficiently, but also be safer in a sustainable way? I mean, it's just like winning all around. So I would say check Silas Ascend program out. We'll leave it at that.
I wish I could afford you, but you're hired either way.
That's kind of my MO these days. I wish I could afford you, but you're still hired. Oh, story of my life.
It's
Ah,
awesome. No, I mean the Ascend program has been really fun. It's been a blast to see people progressing and gaining confidence and doing the thing out there that they're trying to do. It's been really great
nice.
and a good way for me to give back for sure.
Well, do you want to throw out a website, Silas?
Yeah, that's a great question. The website is alpine-logic.com. That's my main website, alpine-logic.com. And you'll see links in there for my personal guiding booking as well as for the Ascend membership. And if you're a guide also, there's Ascend Pro, which is a kind of a cool community for guides and instructors too. So
Yeah.
yeah, kind of
Everybody's on the process of learning. It never stops, no matter
totally.
how good you are or how much experience you have. So
It's one of the reasons I enjoy these conversations so much is because it makes me like rethink and review things that I have thought about for a long time, but never really understood as well, or kind of want to revisit with a new perspective on it, or just get obviously your take on the conversation in general. So I really appreciate being here.
I appreciate being here too. All right, let's enough dribble. Let's just shut off the faucet for now.
Let's wrap it up. All right.
Wrap it
Oh,
up.
one last parting piece of wisdom. Place big pieces. Place the cams tighter than you think. They give more leeway. The smaller the cam gets, the tighter you should place it. Oh, I love tight cams. They're a little harder to get out. Like, don't go crazy, but the spring tension holds them in place better. They're less likely to move, and you get more leeway if it does move before it's totally compromised. So I'm on the tight cam train. What do you think, Dick?
I love watching people place undercam cams, and they're like, "Well, I want to get it out, Mike. I want it to stay in the rock. I would rather it stay in the rock, to be honest.
Don't
it's,
worry,
it's
you'll
my
get it out.
preference." So, uh, taking pieces out, whether they're tightly placed or they've been shifted or they've been weighted, is actually an art. So go weight some pieces and learn the art of taking gear out, which is part of the art of putting gear in. So
Totally. yeah,
I'm
following
with you, especially with small cams or any cams, but small cams especially.
yeah, following a really skilled person and savvy person who's conservatively minded is an amazing way to get good at placing good gear. It's
Yeah,
pretty rad.
for sure.
All
All right,
right,
let's
Dick,
sign off.
thank you.
Thank you.